There was a time when the answer came easily. What do you want? You had something to say. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe it wasn't realistic. But at least it belonged to you. Now, the question feels heavier, not because life became more complicated, but because somewhere along the way, you stopped hearing your own voice. People think not knowing what you want is a lack of direction. It isn't. Most of the time, it's the result of spending years living according to someone else's expectations. You became so good at surviving that you forgot how to choose. You learned what makes people proud, what keeps relationships peaceful, what avoids conflict, what sounds responsible, what looks successful. Eventually, you became fluent in everyone else's language, except your own. And that's the strange part. You can still make decisions. You can still go to work, pay bills, smile when necessary, reply to messages, plan next week. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. But inside, every decision feels empty. Because you're no longer asking, what do I want? You're asking, what am I supposed to want? Those are completely different questions. One leads to a life. The other leads to a performance. Most people never notice the difference. Until one day, they wake up inside a life they worked very hard to build and realize they don't actually want to be there. Not because it's a bad life, because it isn't their life. And that's where the real confusion begins. Not at the beginning, but after years of saying yes to things your heart never chose. So if you've been wondering why nothing feels exciting anymore, why every option feels equally empty, why you can't figure out what you really want, this video isn't here to give you another answer. It's here to help you understand how you lost the question. Some people spend years trying to find themselves, but maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Because you didn't lose yourself. You lost permission to be yourself. Think about how early it starts. As a child, you don't ask whether your dreams make sense. You simply have them. You want things because they make you feel alive. Then little by little, the world begins negotiating with your heart. That's not practical. You should be realistic. People like us don't do that. Don't disappoint everyone. At first, those voices come from other people. Parents, teachers, friends, partners, society. But eventually, you no longer need them to repeat those words. You start repeating them yourself. That's when the prison becomes invisible, because it no longer feels like someone else is controlling your choices. It feels like you're choosing them. But are you? Or are you simply choosing the version of yourself that everyone else finds easier to accept? Here's something uncomfortable. Many adults don't know what they want because they've spent 20 years becoming who they were rewarded for being, not who they actually were. Approval is addictive, especially when it arrives slowly. A compliment, a promotion, someone saying they're proud of you, people calling you responsible, reliable, mature, successful. None of those things are bad. The danger comes when your identity becomes dependent on earning them, because then every decision starts serving your image instead of your life. You stop asking, will this make me happy? And start asking, will this disappoint someone? One question creates freedom, the other creates performance. Over time, you become incredibly efficient, at living a life that looks right, while feeling completely disconnected inside it. That's why so many people say, I should be grateful, and they are. But gratitude can't replace authenticity. You can appreciate everything you have and still realize it isn't who you are. That's not selfish. That's honesty. And honesty is usually where people begin finding themselves again. Not by discovering something new, but by admitting what they've been pretending not to know all along. There is a quiet tragedy that almost nobody notices. It doesn't happen when someone tells you what to do. It happens when you stop noticing that you're no longer choosing. Most people don't wake up one morning and decide, I'll spend my life living for other people. It happens gradually. One expectation becomes another. One obligation becomes a lifestyle. One compromise becomes your identity. Eventually, you no longer know where their expectations end and your desires begin. Imagine someone asking you, if nobody could judge you, what would you do? Many people can't answer, not because they don't have dreams, because they've spent so many years editing themselves that the original answer disappeared. That's what happens when approval becomes survival. You stop exploring. You start performing. You don't choose what feels meaningful. You choose what receives applause. And applause is one of the most dangerous addictions because it sounds a lot like love. The strange thing is, people often congratulate you for becoming someone you never wanted to be. They say, you've done so well. You've made it. You should be proud. Maybe they're right. Maybe you've built a beautiful life, a successful career, a stable routine, a respectable reputation. But none of those things answer the only question that matters. Did you choose this? Or did you simply become who everyone expected? Those are not the same life. Some of the saddest people aren't the ones who failed. They're the ones who succeeded at the wrong dream. They climbed every step, made every sacrifice, ignored every doubt, reached the top, then quietly realized they never wanted to be there. That realization doesn't happen overnight. It arrives slowly, usually late at night, or during a long drive, or while staring out a window, thinking, why doesn't any of this feel like mine? That's the moment people think they've lost themselves. But maybe they're finally seeing how long they've been absent. There's something else that makes this even harder. The longer you've lived someone else's life, the more expensive it feels to admit it, because then you have to face the years, the time, the energy, the sacrifices. Your mind whispers, you've come too far to change now, but that's another lie. Time doesn't become more valuable because you've already spent it. The only question is, how much more are you willing to spend before you start living a life that actually belongs to you? There comes a point when your own voice starts feeling unfamiliar, not because it disappeared, because it hasn't been heard for a very long time. The strange thing about intuition is that it rarely shouts. It whispers, very quietly, I don't think this is right. I'm not happy. This doesn't feel like me. Most people hear that voice the first few times. Then they ignore it. Not because they don't care, because they have responsibilities, bills, family, expectations, deadlines. Eventually, the whisper becomes background noise. And after enough years, silence. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to know what everyone else wants? You know what your boss expects. You know what your partner hopes for. You know what your parents would choose. You know what society rewards. But ask yourself, what do I want? Suddenly, everything becomes quiet, not peaceful, empty. That silence didn't appear overnight. It was created, one ignored feeling at a time. Every time your heart said, this doesn't feel right, and your mind answered, do it anyway, a small distance formed between you and yourself. At first, the distance was tiny, almost impossible to notice. Then it happened again, and again, and again, until one day, you looked at your own life and felt like a visitor, not because your life was wrong, because you no longer recognized the person living it. One of the greatest misconceptions about adulthood is that maturity means ignoring yourself. People admire those who sacrifice everything, who never complain, who always put others first, who keep going no matter what. But there's a hidden cost. If every decision requires abandoning yourself, eventually there won't be much of you left. People call that responsibility. Sometimes it's self-abandonment, and those two things are not the same. Think about a compass. If it's only 1 degree off, you won't notice immediately. The path still looks correct, but after enough distance, you end up somewhere completely different. That's what happens when you ignore your own voice, not once, but hundreds or thousands of times. Each decision feels small, almost harmless, until years later, you arrive somewhere you never intended to go. Then you wonder, how did I end up here? The answer is almost never one big decision. It's thousands of small ones, made while trying to become who everyone else needed you to be. The hardest part isn't hearing your own voice again. It's trusting it, because after years of ignoring yourself, your intuition feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious. You begin asking, what if I'm wrong? But maybe the better question is, what has ignoring myself already cost me? Sometimes the life you've been searching for doesn't begin when you discover something new. It begins the first time you stop arguing with what you've known all along. There's a fear that quietly controls millions of lives. It isn't failure. It isn't rejection. It isn't even loneliness. It's disappointing people. For many, that fear is stronger than the desire to be happy. Think about that. How many decisions have you made simply because you didn't want someone else to be disappointed? Maybe you stayed because leaving would have hurt them. Maybe you accepted the job because everyone said it was a great opportunity. Maybe you kept saying yes because saying no felt selfish. None of those choices felt dramatic. Each one seemed reasonable, responsible, kind, but together they slowly built a life that didn't belong to you. One of the hardest truths about growing older is realizing you cannot live without disappointing someone. No matter what you choose, someone will disagree, someone will misunderstand, someone will wish you had made a different decision. That's unavoidable. The real question is, who are you willing to disappoint? Other people or yourself? Because one of them will happen. Always. People often believe they're keeping the peace, that sometimes they're only postponing conflict. You avoid one difficult conversation today, only to spend years living with its consequences. You protect someone else's comfort while quietly abandoning your own. From the outside, it looks generous. Inside, it feels like disappearing. There's something strange about people pleasing. At first, it feels like kindness. Then, it becomes identity. You become the reliable one, the easy one, the understanding one. Everyone appreciates you. Everyone depends on you. Everyone expects you to keep being the same person until the day you finally say no. That's when something surprising happens. Some people become uncomfortable, not because you've changed, because you've stopped being predictable. They weren't attached to your happiness. They were attached to your availability. This is why boundaries feel so uncomfortable. Not because they're wrong, because they reveal which relationships were built on access instead of respect. Some people celebrate the healthier version of you. Others resent it, not because you've become worse, because they benefited from the version who never chose themselves. One day, you'll realize something. You don't actually fear making the wrong decision. You fear what people will think if you make the right one for yourself. And that's a very different fear. Because one questions your judgment, the other questions your worth. The day you stop living for applause will also be the day you disappoint people who were only clapping because you never challenged their expectations. That isn't failure, that's clarity, because every life built on approval eventually demands a sacrifice of authenticity. The question is, how much of yourself are you willing to trade before you finally decide the cost is too high? For years, you've been looking for the right answer, the right career, the right relationship, the right purpose, the right decision, the right version of yourself. But what if the problem was never the lack of answers? What if the problem was you've spent so long listening to everyone else that you can no longer recognize your own voice? Most people don't suffer because they don't know enough. They suffer because every opinion sounds louder than their own. Someone says, you should stay. Another says, You should leave. Someone tells you to follow your passion. Someone else says to be practical. Everyone has advice. Very few people have your life. Think about it. How many decisions have you delayed because you wanted one more opinion, one more book, one more video, one more sign, one more confirmation that you're making the right choice? Sometimes searching for certainty is simply another way of avoiding responsibility, because as long as you're still searching, you don't have to choose. And choosing is terrifying, because once you choose, you can no longer pretend you were waiting. There comes a moment when you have to stop collecting answers and start trusting your awareness, not your impulse, not your fear. Your awareness. They're different. Fear asks, what if I lose? Awareness asks, what have I already lost? By refusing to decide, that question changes everything. You don't rebuild your relationship with yourself through one dramatic decision. You rebuild it through hundreds of small moments, saying no when every part of you used to say yes, resting without feeling guilty, admitting, I don't want this anymore, choosing something because it feels true, not because it looks impressive. Every honest decision becomes evidence that your own voice is still there, waiting patiently, not angry, not offended, just waiting for you to listen again. The strange thing is, your real desires rarely arrive with excitement. They arrive with relief. When something is truly yours, it often feels quieter than you expected, less dramatic, less impressive, but more peaceful, because for the first time, you're no longer performing, you're simply living. Maybe that's why so many people don't recognize their own dreams anymore. They've spent years chasing excitement, recognition, achievement, approval. Meanwhile, their real life has been quietly waiting behind a much simpler question. What feels honest? Not what looks successful. Not what will everyone admire. Just what feels true. Because the life that belongs to you will never need to convince you to stay. Maybe you've been asking the wrong question. Not, what do I want? But, how do I become the person everyone expects me to be? Those two questions can create two completely different lives. One builds approval, the other builds peace. There is something most people don't realize until much later. The life that belongs to you doesn't disappear because you ignored it. It waits, quietly, not demanding, not chasing you, simply waiting for the moment you become honest enough to notice it again. You don't need to become someone new. You don't need to reinvent yourself. You don't need to quit everything tomorrow. Most of the time, the way back is surprisingly small. One honest conversation, one decision you've been postponing, one boundary you've been afraid to set, one sentence you've been afraid to admit. I don't want this anymore. That sentence terrifies people because they think it destroys everything. Sometimes it's the sentence that finally begins their real life. Here's something I hope you'll remember. You don't wake up one day living someone else's life. You arrive there, one compromise at a time, which also means you don't return to yourself all at once. You return one honest decision at a time, one choice, one boundary, one truth, repeated until your life finally begins to sound like your own voice again. One day, someone may ask you, "What do you want?" And for the first time in a very long time, you won't answer with what sounds responsible or practical or impressive. You'll answer with something that feels true. And that moment will probably be much quieter than you imagined. No celebration, no dramatic music, just relief. Because after years of living for everyone else, you'll finally recognize the person you've been trying to find. It was never someone waiting at the end of the journey. It was the voice you stopped listening to. If this conversation stayed with you, and you want to go further than what fits into one video, I've put those deeper reflections into something you can return to any time. The Raw Mind digital collection isn't about motivation. It's about understanding yourself, one honest page at a time. If you're curious, you'll find it through the link in the description. Take your time. Some truths are meant to be read more than once. Subscribe CTA. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing to Raw Mind, not because you need more advice, but because every week we explore the conversations most people spend their lives avoiding. If that's the kind of conversation you've been looking for, I'll see you in the next one. Before you leave, I want to leave you with one question. If no one expected anything from you, no opinions, no pressure, no fear of disappointing anyone, what would you choose? Don't answer immediately. Sit with it, because the answer may be the first honest conversation you've had with yourself in years. Until next time, stay honest,